How you guys doing? It's been a while. Thought I'd get on here and talk about old ideas versus new ideas. I might do this about a couple of them. Today, I want to talk about government. You know I love the Bible, and really I love the Old Testament and New Testament. I love the Talmud. I love the Quran. I love reading lots of religious texts. But what I want to do is I want to talk about old religious ideas, the ideas that are the foundations of our civilization. In the Bible, uh, when we talk about governments, really, it starts with governments building building big towers and getting greedy, and then it transitions to governments oppressing people and making slave classes, and then it gets to people of faith should have governments that are judges and people that make decisions. And basically, it says that when we switch from people that make decisions being in control to one guy in charge, that what happens is one guy in charge gets gets corrupted and starts making bad decisions and gets bloody and gets self-centered and has a difficult time keeping his faith. And it's an interesting thing because we see in the Bible, we see how David goes from being a hero to being a tyrant to being kind of in between and kind of realizing his mistakes, but really not being perfect. And we see that ultimately decisions that people like that make lead to the fall of their empire. But it's a whole interesting thing because really, what the Bible does talk about is it talks about accountability. It talks about how the society should take care of its homeless and its widows and its orphans, and the ways that you do that, whether it be from taking a tax or to leaving the corner of your field open. There's all these ways that society should take care of its poor and its hurt and its in need, and that's why we have governments. But you know, since also after that, you look at the time of Jesus. The time of Jesus is like, well, what we should do is we should do God's things over here and government's things over here, and in the Quran, it's more about we should focus on justice and and we should take care of people and be accountable. Uh, and there's, you know, it's an interesting thing because there's all these things that happen, and all those things are true. And I think that everybody, regardless of their political stance, believes that there's corruption when one guy is in charge. We all believe that government should be held accountable, and we we all want to take care of people in need. That's the whole world. And what's interesting though is there are things that religious texts don't cover, and like a good example of that would be corporations. And what is a corporation? Corporations, like, kind of been around for 800 years, but really only been around for 300-400 years. Um, but these are structures that basically allow people to do business, and they do it without harm to themselves in most laws. There's places where maybe that's not quite how it works, but in the world now, it's an interesting thing because our challenges are really coming from ideas about who can own what. And mostly that's corporations. That's also about individuals that own lots of land. Um, that, that greed is happening. And our faiths tell us to fight greed, but they don't tell us if corporations are a good or a bad thing. Those we just have to practice and kind of find out. Well, the interesting thing is like today in the world. The United States, we're the biggest. So we're like the Egypt of the whole world. We're the guy that's in charge and kind of trying to make everybody else do what we want. And that's, I don't know if that's just how the world would see us because that's who we are. We're the biggest, and the biggest people usually has the most interest. They're usually the most tied to security or whatever. And so for whatever reason, there's always people that stand up with us against us, and usually that comes from the story of Moses in the Bible. That whole idea. So those people are doing things that Americans hold dear in their heart. But it's interesting because with this whole concept of, you know, corporations and things that are modern, you've got people like Venezuela, who they're kind of a Catholic background, kind of definitely a socialist kind of communist background, and you know they really don't like land ownership, and they hate corporations because of monopolies, which we do too, but we just don't like the title socialist. But they hate us, or oh, wait, it's Maduro hated us because of our corporate structure. You go read the news and look at all the things and all the things that happened in the last 40 years with Venezuela. It was typically them battling our oil industry and our oil corporations. Well, that was his politics. An interesting thing is if you go to Iran, Iran isn't particularly socialist. I would say that they're a family values government. And they also hate America because of our oil corporations. And they don't like our corporate structure because it's led by secularists. And they think that America's separation from our traditional faith is what makes us make not fair decisions, and we do things that are corrupt, and that's how they see us. And it's an interesting thing because you have a fairly right wing idea and a fairly left wing idea that both hate us because they don't like how our corporations have acted, and how ownership's acted, and they both feel like their countries got the short end of the stick because of how global oil worked. Well, I'm not here to say that those corporations are bad guys or good guys, but it's a tricky thing because in America, we know that guys like Elon Musk might get us to Mars, but we also hate monopolies and we hate corporations and we complain about our healthcare corporation, and we know that there are problems with when corporations get too big. And the thing that's tricky is that's where the world is right now. These are ideas that have been working themselves out since the last 400 years, and we've got to kind of figure out, well, and to be fair, corporations are probably who defeated the British and made it so that monarchy is not a thing. So they're not all bad, but they're also something that the core of who we are and our morality doesn't really know how to handle. And so that said, what we end up with is we end up with a world that all agrees that corruption's the worst. And we all know that governments are problems. And we just don't know how to handle this particular type of corruption. And then we end up imagining that people that are on the other side and whose opinions are different than ours come from a different faith or a different foundation of background truth. Well, the truth is we've got to figure out how big is too big for a government. How big is too big for a corporation? How do we make corporations big enough to change the world? How do we get to outer space? How do we save humanity when when our sun changes? How far off is that? Who knows? These are things that we're working on trying to figure out. Hopefully, God's working with us, and we're working on His timeline, and we're going to get there. But we don't know when that's going to be or how that's going to be. And while we're figuring it out, I think it would be good for the world to understand that there are discrepancies in what we know from the past. And there are problems that we're working towards fixing in the future. We need to understand that nobody's perfect and we don't have good answers for everything. And we've got to have political systems that let us try lots of things. We don't need monopolies. We don't need one guy in charge. We need lots of little guys all working together and figuring out how to make decisions where you don't have one guy that's got to be in charge of everything, because once those piles of money get too big, people do get corrupt. Anyway, I'm thinking about it, and I'm curious what you guys are thinking. So, if you've got any ideas, I'd love to hear from you and see what you think can make the world a better place. Anyway, that's all I got today. You have a wonderful rest of your day.